I thought I was just fixing a kitchen sink. That's what the work order said anyway. One faucet, one old lady, one quiet house on the edge of town. But by the time I packed up my toolbox 3 weeks later, I'd been pulled into something I never expected. Someone's memory, someone's loss, and maybe, for just a moment, someone's healing. It's funny how the smallest leaks can lead to the deepest places. And sometimes, you think you're just a handyman, but to someone else, you're a safe place they haven't felt in 50 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring when I got the call. The job was logged through the local community app, not one of the big commercial platforms. That usually meant someone older, not so great with technology, probably had a kid or neighbor help them post it. The listing read, leaky kitchen faucet, water pooling under sink, small dog in home, please knock. There was a little note at the bottom that said, I'm usually home all day. That line stuck with me. Something about the way it was written. Plain. Like a quiet wave for help. Not just plumbing. The house was tucked into a cul-de-sac I didn't even know existed. Near the edge of Oak Hollow. An old part of town where the mailboxes were all rusted, and the cars had stories older than I was. Most of the houses looked like their last coats of paint had been done during Clinton's first term. But there was something charming about the way they stood. Stubborn, worn, but still standing. Her house was pale yellow with white shutters, a front porch that sagged slightly in the middle, and wind chimes that clinked faintly in the breeze like a lazy metronome. I parked the van, grabbed my bag, and knocked twice. The door creaked open, a few inches, and I saw an eye peer through the crack. You must be the sink guy, she said. I told her my name was Sam from Riverside Repairs, and she let me in. She said her name was Marlene. Thanks for coming. It's just me and Penny, and she's too small to hold a wrench. Penny turned out to be a wiry little terrier mix with anxious energy and a face like someone's grandkid's favorite stuffed animal. She barked once, then disappeared down the hallway, as if embarrassed by the outburst. Marlene looked to be in her mid-70s, maybe older, but not the hunched-over type. She had posture. She moved slow but deliberate, like she'd practiced every motion to conserve energy and grace. Her hair was swept into a loose bun, 2 silver strands falling along her cheeks. Her eyes weren't tired. They were alert, watchful, but quiet. She led me through a small living room with plastic runners still covering parts of the carpet, past a TV that looked like it hadn't been turned on in months, and into the kitchen. It was neat, uncluttered, clean to the point of being impersonal. No magnets on the fridge, no spice rack, no grocery list or kids' artwork. There, she said, pointing toward the sink. It started as a drip. Now it sounds like a nervous bladder. I crouched down and got to work. Pipes were rusted. Seal was loose. Nothing complicated, just old. While I worked, she leaned on the counter and sipped tea from a mug that said, "Best day ever," in chipped cursive. At one point she asked me if I did this full-time. I said, yeah, been running my own thing for 3 years. She said her husband used to do handyman work. Not always well, but with enthusiasm, she added. That made me smile. She laughed once, soft and slow, the kind of laugh that hadn't had many reasons to come out recently. I finished the patch-up and ran the faucet. No leaks. Tight seals. It sounded fine. I could have left then, signed the invoice, taken the check, moved on to the next job. But something about the house felt like a waiting room, like it had been paused for years. I'll have to order a new fixture, I told her. This one's got more bandages than function. Should I come back Thursday? She didn't answer right away, just stared at the running water like it was telling her something only she could hear. Thursday's fine, she finally said, eyes still locked on the sink. As I packed up my tools, she walked me to the door. Penny reappeared and followed us like a tiny limping shadow. Just before I stepped out, she said something simple. Thank you for showing up. I nodded and told her, of course, it's what I do. But then she said it again, quieter this time. No, I mean, showing up. Then she closed the door gently behind me. I sat in my van for a moment before driving off. My next job was across town, something about a garbage disposal and a cat with a sink fetish. But my thoughts stayed with that house, those eyes, and the strange stillness of a life that felt paused. I didn't know it then, but I'd be back far more than just Thursday. The job was a sink. The real story, that was just beginning. I came back that Thursday like I said I would. The replacement faucet was in the back of the van, wrapped in cardboard and foam, still in the box. It was a brushed nickel design, modern but not flashy, something that looked sturdy, something that might last a while without drawing too much attention. I pulled up to the same quiet cul-de-sac, the same wind chimes ticking softly against the breeze, and I noticed the same front porch sag in the middle, like a tired sigh. But this time, Marlene was already at the door before I knocked. She must have been watching from the window. She opened it without a word, stepped back like before, and I walked in with my tools and the new fixture under my arm. Penny barked, once, and then ran behind the couch again, her usual routine of fake warning followed by retreat. The living room hadn't changed, and I hadn't expected it to. Same plastic runners, same untouched television, same faint smell of tea and lavender. Furniture polish. Some people's homes evolve slowly. You can feel the years move through them. Others feel frozen, like they've stayed exactly the same since the last person left. Marlene's house was the latter. The kitchen was still spotless. She had moved a small vase with a single fake sunflower onto the counter since the last visit, maybe in honor of the faucet's imminent upgrade. I set the box down, opened it, and started laying out the parts. Marlene stood nearby, arms folded across her chest, watching me with the same quiet eyes, not in judgment, not even in curiosity, more like she was just anchoring herself in the moment. "Should take about an hour," I said, as I unboxed the fixtures and opened the cabinet beneath the sink. She nodded without a word and leaned against the counter again, that chipped "Best Day Ever" mug back in her hands. This time, she wasn't drinking from it, just holding it like a totem, something solid and familiar to grip while the world moved slowly around her. Installing the new faucet was uneventful, technically speaking. The old fittings came off with a little persuasion. The new hardware slid into place without a fight, and the connections held firm as I tightened everything into position. But something felt different about the work. Normally I move quickly, efficiently, with a mental checklist and a clock in the back of my head. But today, I took my time. I double-checked the sealant. I cleaned the threads. I even polished the base plate before screwing it down. Marlene didn't say much, but she didn't leave either. She stayed close enough that I could sense her presence without looking. Every now and then she would ask a small question. How long had I been doing this? Where did I grow up? What was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever been asked to fix? And I'd answer between tasks, offering short pieces of myself like breadcrumbs. I didn't even realize I was doing it until I noticed I'd been talking more than usual. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When the job was done, I ran the water and let her test it herself. She reached out, turned the handle slowly, and watched the stream flow steadily into the sink. She didn't smile, not really, but her shoulders dropped a little, like a weight she didn't know she'd been carrying had shifted. "It's beautiful," she said, almost to herself. I stood back and packed up my tools without rushing. She offered me a glass of water before I left, and for some reason, I accepted. We sat at the small table by the window, the one without chairs across from it. Just the one seat, her seat. And she poured the water into a matching mug, not a glass, because apparently she didn't use glasses much anymore. Something about the way she placed the mug in front of me felt formal, like a ceremony. She asked more questions. Where was I living now? Did I have family nearby? I told her my dad had passed a few years back and my mom lived out in Arizona. I mentioned I'd been divorced 2 years earlier. She didn't ask why. Just nodded and looked down at her hands, tracing the rim of her mug. "I lost my husband 10 years ago," she said finally. "Heart gave out in the garage. Just like that." I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She continued after a few seconds, more like she was following a thread inside herself than telling me a story. "He used to fix things too. Not professionally, but he liked to tinker. Kept his hands busy. The sink was the last thing he tried to fix. Didn't finish. Her eyes drifted toward the counter, toward the new faucet, gleaming faintly in the afternoon light. We sat in silence for a while after that. Not awkward silence. The kind of silence where two people exist without having to fill the air with noise. Outside, the wind chimes tapped softly against each other, lazy and rhythmic, like distant church bells on a weekday. Eventually, I stood and thanked her for the water. She didn't walk me to the door this time, just stood there, mug in hand, and nodded. "Take care, Sam," she said. I nodded back and left. But the strange thing was, as I walked back to my van, I realized I felt lighter. Like I'd stepped out of something heavier than I'd realized. Like the house had let go of some air it had been holding in its lungs. I drove home thinking about that sink, not because it was a tough job, it wasn't, but because it had somehow led me into a space I hadn't expected to enter. Someone's grief, someone's quiet, someone's remembering. And I had a feeling it wasn't over. That, somehow, even if the plumbing was fixed, there was still something else she needed help with. Something less obvious. Something unspoken. And maybe, just maybe, I'd show up again. Just to see if I could help fix that too. I didn't plan on going back the next day. I told myself the job was done, the bill was paid, the client satisfied. I told myself it was just another service call on another weekday. But I also left my flashlight under her sink on purpose. It wasn't the kind of mistake I usually made. My tools are like extensions of my body. I don't forget them. But this time I did. I noticed it halfway through another job across town. And instead of brushing it off and waiting until next week to retrieve it, I wrapped up early and drove straight back to Oak Hollow. The flashlight was just an excuse, and I knew it. There was something in that house, something unspoken, unfinished, that tugged at the part of me I normally keep pretty sealed up. It wasn't romance, it wasn't pity, it wasn't even curiosity. It was something quieter, a kind of recognition. I knew what it felt like to be in a house full of silence. I knew what it meant to miss someone and still keep making tea like they were coming back any minute. The wind chimes greeted me first, just like before. They seemed to play the same slow rhythm every time I approached the porch, like the house had its own theme song that never needed changing. Marlene opened the door again before I knocked. She didn't look surprised. She didn't ask why I was there. She just stepped aside and said, "Penny's hiding. You startled her nap." I told her I forgot my flashlight. She said she figured I'd come back. I walked through the same living room, which somehow felt slightly different now, as if it had warmed up just a few degrees, like a room after someone lights a candle. The flashlight was exactly where I left it, tucked behind the pipes, still pointing toward the back of the cabinet, like it had been doing an overnight shift. I could have just picked it up and left, but I lingered. I asked if she needed help with anything else, leaky windows, squeaky doors, outlets that didn't work. She said everything worked just fine. But then she opened the fridge and sighed. The light was out. Nothing major, just the little bulb inside. I said I could swap it out if she had a spare, and she handed me a pack of bulbs from a drawer that had at least 10 random batteries, 3 rubber bands, and a measuring tape with no numbers left on it. I replaced the bulb, closed the fridge, and turned to say something. I don't remember what. But before I could, she was already pouring 2 mugs of tea. We sat again at the little kitchen table, me in the guest chair and her in her usual place, as if this was already a routine we'd established. This time there was a plate of shortbread cookies between us, store-bought, but the kind that crumbles just enough when you bite in. She asked me how business had been lately, and I told her it was steady, nothing dramatic. I liked it that way. She said she liked quiet too, but sometimes too much quiet can sound loud. I knew exactly what she meant. There's a kind of silence that feels like pressure. It fills every room and makes the ticking clock sound like a hammer. She didn't have to explain it. It was in the way she folded her napkin even though it wasn't dirty. It was in the way she looked out the window between sentences, as if expecting someone to be standing there. After a while, she got up and brought out an old photo album. It was frayed at the edges, corners dulled by decades of page-turning. She said she hadn't looked through it in a while but felt like maybe she should. She didn't ask if I wanted to see it. She just opened it on the table and began pointing at pictures. Her husband, Jack, always with grease on his hands. Loved fixing up old radios, never wore gloves, said he needed to feel the wires with his fingers. There was a photo of them dancing in the living room, furniture pushed back, a record player on the ground spinning something slow. There was one of their daughter, Lily, at age 6, wearing a cardboard crown and holding a plastic wand. She's in Oregon now, Marlene said. Sends postcards, doesn't like phones. The way she said it made it clear there was more to the story, but she wasn't ready to go there yet. I didn't push. When we finished the tea and the cookies were mostly crumbs, I stood to leave. She didn't protest. She just walked me to the door like before and said, "Don't forget anything this time." I told her I wouldn't. As I walked back down the porch steps, she added, "If you happen to drive by this way next week, I have a stubborn screen door, but only if you're nearby." I smiled and nodded. It wasn't about the door. We both knew that. I drove home with the windows cracked, letting the breeze chase away the scent of tea that still lingered on my clothes. I should have felt strange about the visits, about how familiar they were starting to feel, but I didn't. It was like being invited into a memory that hadn't finished playing yet, like stepping into someone's unfinished sentence. The next week, I stopped by again. This time I brought a new screen door hinge in case that one really was stubborn. It wasn't. It just squeaked a little. But I replaced it anyway. Marlene made grilled cheese sandwiches that day. Said she hadn't made them in years. Used to be Jack's favorite lunch on rainy days. It wasn't raining, but I guess the clouds were close enough. We ate in the living room this time, Penny curled up in a sunbeam near the wall, twitching in her sleep. The television remained off. It always was. Instead, she asked me questions about places I'd been, places I wanted to go. I told her I'd never left the country. She said she went to Italy once in her 20s, said the air there smelled like tomato vines and church incense. She paused after that and went quiet for a while. Then she said something that sat in the space between us like a feather drifting down in slow motion. "In 50 years, she said, eyes still on her half-eaten sandwich. "No one's made me feel this safe." I didn't know what to say. I didn't think she meant it romantically. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was something older, deeper, like the comfort of being seen, heard, and not expected to perform. I nodded and looked down at my hands. We sat there a little longer, letting the silence stretch without breaking it. Penny twitched again, and the wind chimes tapped out their lazy rhythm in the distance. After that day, something shifted. I wouldn't say the air was different, but the way time moved around us was. I didn't plan my visits anymore. I didn't pencil her in between sink jobs or call ahead to see if she needed something fixed. I just started showing up, sometimes with a reason, sometimes with none. She never acted surprised. She never asked why. She always opened the door the same way, with one hand on the knob and the other brushing a silver strand of hair from her cheek like a ritual. Penny barked a little less every time. The living room stayed the same, but there were small signs of life beginning to poke through. An open curtain one afternoon that let sunlight spill in over the couch. A bowl of fruit. That hadn't been there before. A pair of gardening gloves resting on the table by the back door. She told me once that she'd started trimming the hedges again. Said the yard felt like it was waking up, and maybe she should, too. There was a rhythm to it now. Sometimes I'd bring her something. Extra screws, a tin of cookies from the bakery. Near my place, a roll of weather sealant for the windows. She'd always accept it with the same soft thank you, like she wasn't used to being on the receiving end anymore. Other times she'd have little things prepared, like a folded napkin set next to a mug or a crossword puzzle half finished on the table, waiting for someone to argue over clues. We talked more, not always about big things, but the kind of small, drifting conversations that don't need a destination. She'd tell me about Jack again, but not in the heavy way people talk about loss. She spoke like he was still lingering in the room somewhere, not a ghost, but a presence she still made room for. He hated mint tea, she'd say with a grin, pouring me a cup. Said it tasted like toothpaste. I make it now just to spite his memory. I never corrected her, even though I knew she had mint tea every day. It wasn't about spite. Once, during one of our quiet afternoons, she pulled out a box from the hall closet. Said she wanted help moving it to the garage. It was heavier than it looked, full of old books and sheet music, and as I carried it out, I noticed something tucked in between the binders, an old recorder, the kind kids use in school. When I asked her about it, she said she used to teach music. Elementary school, 3 decades of sticky fingers and out-of-tune concerts. She said she missed the chaos of it, the sound of 30 kids trying to play the same note and never quite landing on it. They used to call me Miss L, she said, looking out the garage window. Short for Langford, or lunatic, depending on the day. She smiled at the memory, and something about it made me picture her younger, standing in front of a classroom, trying to conduct joy with a plastic baton and a box of mismatched instruments. We stayed out in the garage for a while that day. It smelled like old cardboard and rust, like most garages do. But there was something else too. Something warm in the way the light filtered through the slats in the door, casting slow, soft-moving shadows across the concrete. I asked her if she ever thought about playing again, and she waved the idea away like a fly, said her fingers weren't what they used to be. But later that week, when I stopped by unannounced, I heard something faint through the screen door before I knocked. It wasn't a melody, not really. Just a few tentative notes being pressed into the air. When she opened the door, her cheeks were a little flushed. She didn't mention the sound. Neither did I. There was one afternoon, not long after that, when we sat in the backyard for the first time. It was warm, the kind of warmth that doesn't beg for shade, just invites you to stay still and notice the breeze. She had a folding chair, and I brought one from my van. Penny lay between us, ears twitching as birds rustled in the trees. Marlene told me about a trip she and Jack had taken once to Maine, years ago. They'd rented a cabin near the coast, eaten lobster rolls that dripped down their wrists, gotten lost on a foggy hiking trail, and ended up at a stranger's bonfire party. She told the story like it was fresh, like the salt was still on her lips and her shoes were still wet from the trail. When she finished, she looked down at her hands and said, "It's strange how the memories come back sharper the older I get, like they've been sitting in the attic, getting clearer instead of dustier." I didn't say much. I've never been great with words in those moments. But I listened, really listened. And I think she felt that. Because the silence that followed wasn't heavy or awkward. It was full. Full of understanding, of respect, of shared space. Eventually the sun started to dip behind the trees and I stood to leave. As I folded my chair, she said, "Most people don't know how to sit in silence anymore." I nodded and told her I didn't mind it. She said, "That's what makes you different." Then she looked at me the same way she did the day she told me about Jack. The kind of look that makes you feel like you've just been measured and found exactly enough. I drove home slower that evening, not because of traffic or because I had nowhere else to be, but because I was thinking about what it means to hold space for someone, about how fixing a sink can turn into something else entirely, and about how sometimes the most important repairs aren't the ones with wrenches or screws. They're the kind that happen quietly, through presence, through patience, through just showing up. I hadn't expected any of this. Not from a job that started with a leaky faucet and a barky little dog, but there I was, building a rhythm with a woman I barely knew a month ago, and somehow it felt like the most honest work I'd done in years. There were some days I didn't visit, and those days felt longer than they should have. Not because I had nothing else to do. My schedule stayed full, calls kept coming, drains kept clogging, and wires kept fraying. But there was a different kind of emptiness to the hours now. Like I had grown used to a kind of quiet I didn't know I needed, until I'd found it, and when it was gone, even for a day, the rest of the world felt louder and somehow less meaningful. I'd work through a list of appointments and find myself pausing between jobs, staring out the windshield of the van with the windows down, wondering if Marlene had made tea, or if she'd brought Penny out to the backyard for one of their slow afternoon strolls across the garden path. The world kept moving, of course, but a piece of me had started orbiting that little yellow house on the edge of Oak Hollow, whether I was physically there or not. It wasn't that I was falling in love with her. That's the part I should make clear. It wasn't that at all. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't infatuation. It wasn't some sentimental need to rescue someone or be rescued. What was happening was deeper and quieter, like something growing under the soil that hasn't broken the surface yet but is very much alive. She gave me space to breathe differently, to speak without performing, to be still without feeling like something was wrong. And somehow, I think I gave her the same. Not because I was special, but because I didn't ask anything from her. I didn't demand her past, or press for her pain, or try to fix the parts of her life that weren't broken. I just showed up, and for her, that seemed to be enough. One Saturday morning, I found myself outside a small antique shop near the river, a place I usually avoided because it was full of dusty shelves and overpriced memories. But something in the window caught my eye as I was passing by. A faded wooden metronome, the old-fashioned kind with the swinging pendulum and the little brass weight. I walked in, mostly on impulse, and picked it up. It was scratched on the bottom and leaned slightly to the left, like it had spent years correcting its own rhythm. I bought it without thinking too much about why, wrapped it in an old towel in the back of the van, and drove to Marlene's. She was out front when I pulled up, tending to the flowers along the porch railing. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and a pair of gloves that had once been white but now bore the stubborn memory of 100 gardening sessions. When she saw me, she didn't wave, just smiled and kept working, as if my arrival was as natural as the breeze that rustled the hedges. I walked up and handed her the wrapped bundle. She looked at it, then up at me, then back down as she slowly peeled back the towel. When she saw what was inside, she didn't say anything at first. She just ran her fingers gently along the edge of the metronome, like she was reading it in Braille. Then she gave a small nod and said, "I used to have one just like this." We brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table, next to the mug and the crossword, and the single sunflower that had somehow survived another week without fading. She wound it up and let it tick. The sound was soft but certain, steady, and patient, like the heartbeat of a story that had paused for a while but was now ready to begin again. She told me she used to keep one in her classroom, said it helped the kids stay in tempo even when their instruments refused to cooperate. "I think it helped me more than them," she added. "Kept me sane." The way she looked at it, like she was seeing old friends dance again, made me glad I had stopped at the shop. I hadn't brought it as a gesture. I hadn't meant for it to be symbolic. But sometimes the most meaningful things are the ones we don't mean. The days began to take on a pattern. I'd drop by a few times a week, sometimes to fix something, sometimes just to sit. She never ran out of stories, but she also didn't mind silence. We could spend whole afternoons in parallel presence, her reading a book and me nursing a second cup of tea with only the metronome marking time between us. There was comfort in that rhythm, in the slow tick-tock that filled the space without asking for attention. It was the sound of something lasting, something that didn't need to be loud to be real. One afternoon I brought over an old radio I'd been meaning to fix. Not a big project, just a dusty little tabletop set from the 60s with a busted dial. I thought it might be fun, maybe spark a memory or get her talking about Jack again. She lit up when she saw it, said they used to have one just like it, in their first apartment. We spent the next hour in the garage, huddled over the radio with our sleeves rolled up, her pointing and me soldering, both of us pretending we knew exactly what we were doing. At one point, she reached over and adjusted the wire I was holding, her hand brushing mine, and for a moment everything stopped. The ticking, the talking, even Penny, who had been pawing lazily at a moth in the corner. It wasn't a romantic moment. It was a human one. Two people colliding in the middle of memory and motion, not needing anything from the touch, except the reminder that connection was still possible. The radio crackled back to life just before sunset. Static at first, then a faint, warbled song from a local station. She laughed. A real laugh this time. Not just a breath of amusement, but something round and full that came from deep in her chest. It was the first time I had heard that sound, from her, and it wrapped around the garage like sunlight through the rafters. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. That sound was enough. When I left that night, the air felt heavier. Not sad, just full. Like the house had been waiting to exhale and finally did. I sat in the van with the door open, listening to the wind chimes tap out their soft rhythm, and realized something that stopped me cold. I hadn't thought about my own loneliness in days. I hadn't replayed the past, or worried about the future, or counted the steps between me and some invisible goal. I had just been fully, quietly. And that, in a way I didn't have words for, made me feel safe too. I hadn't realized how much of my life was built around the next job, the next invoice, the next obligation, until I started spending time with someone who didn't seem to operate by that kind of clock anymore. Marlene had no schedule beyond sunlight and tea. Her days weren't ruled by urgency or alarms or deadlines. They were ruled by mood, memory, and muscle. Whatever her body could handle, whatever her spirit wanted to revisit. She moved through time like someone who knew it was precious but no longer needed to hoard it. And just by being near that kind of energy, I found myself starting to slow down too. I still worked, still showed up for the leaky toilets and flickering lights and stubborn door handles, but my mind was no longer tethered to just the task. It wandered more. It listened more. It started measuring value in something other than dollars and duration. It was around that time that the neighbors started to notice. Oak Hollow wasn't a busy place, but it wasn't empty either. People noticed patterns. People noticed when a white van showed up 3 times a week and parked in front of the same house. People noticed when a man who didn't belong started waving to mail carriers and chatting with dogs across fences. One morning, as I was unloading a few tools, not because anything was broken, just because I liked having something in my hands, an older man from 2 doors down came over and gave me a look that was somewhere between curious and protective. He didn't ask directly what I was doing there so often. He didn't have to. The implication hung between us like steam from a coffee mug. I told him I was a handyman, which was true. I told him she had a long list of small repairs, which was also true, even if half that list hadn't been written down. He nodded once, slowly, and said, "She's a good woman." Then he turned and walked away. It wasn't a warning. It was a reminder. Inside, Marlene laughed when I told her, said, the neighbors had always been nosy, said she'd once had a woman ask if she was having an affair because she bought a new welcome mat. I asked if she thought the mat was worth it. She said absolutely. But I could tell that part of her was pleased, maybe even warmed, by the idea that someone had noticed she was part of a story again, that her house wasn't just background anymore, that people were wondering about her, thinking about her, seeing her. Loneliness doesn't always show up as silence. Sometimes it shows up as invisibility. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't invisible anymore. One particular afternoon stands out in my mind, not because of anything extraordinary, but because it was exactly the opposite. It was the most ordinary day I'd had in years. I came by with no tools, no radio, no reason. I just wanted to be there. She met me at the door, holding a kitchen towel like she'd just dried a dish. Penny wagged her tail without barking, and I stepped inside like I lived there. I didn't, of course, and never would. But there was something in the way my feet landed on the plastic runners, something in the way my breath settled, that made it feel like I belonged. We didn't speak much at first. She handed me a mug and went back to the stove, where something warm and familiar was simmering. Chicken and rice, simple and perfect. The radio, the one we fixed, was on low in the background, playing some soft jazz station with a signal that came and went like waves against a dock. We ate at the table, slowly, without the need to fill every silence. She told me a little about her daughter, how they used to be close, how distance wasn't just miles, but moments that never happened. We talk, she said, but only in ways that feel safe, like passing a note through a crack in the wall. I didn't press. I knew what it meant to have a relationship full of parentheses, things you meant to say but never did, moments that got paused and never resumed. I told her I had a brother I hadn't seen in years. No fallout, no drama, just drift. People don't always leave you with a bang. Sometimes they just stop showing up. She nodded like she knew that kind of leaving all too well. Then, as we were clearing the table, she stopped suddenly, hands on the counter, and said something I'll never forget. Do you ever think some people are just meant to pass through? Like they're not chapters, just footnotes? I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure how, but later that night, I thought about it more, and I realized the answer was yes. And sometimes those footnotes teach you more than the whole chapter ever did. We started going for walks. Not long ones, just around the block, sometimes to the parked down the street where there was a bench under a crooked oak tree that looked like it had seen everything and forgotten nothing. She walked slowly, one arm looped through mine, not because she needed the help, but because it felt natural. People stared sometimes. A few smiled. A few didn't. We didn't care. She told me once that Jack used to walk ahead of her, always, 10 feet in front, like he was scouting for danger, or rushing towards something he could never quite catch. "I like that you walk beside me," she said. "It feels like we're going somewhere together, even if it's nowhere." That sentence stayed with me for days. As the season started to shift, the air got crisper, and the leaves began their slow turn. I offered to help with yard work, trimming the hedges, clearing the gutters, raking the early fall leaves, but she said not yet. She said she liked the mess, said it reminded her of the years when her house was full of messmakers, back when life happened in every corner, and there was always something to wipe up, fold, or fix. I realized in that moment how much she had given up to hold on to the neatness. Sometimes we clean not to live better, but to erase evidence of what we've lost. That evening, as I was leaving, she stood on the porch with her arms crossed, watching the sun disappear behind the roof lines. The metronome ticked inside, faint, but steady, and the wind chimes played their usual offbeat tune. She didn't say anything dramatic. No confessions. No revelations. She just looked at me and said, "You'll come back tomorrow?" And I said, "Of course," and we both knew it meant more than what it sounded like. The next morning I arrived earlier than usual. The sky was still overcast, the kind of gray that stretches across the sky like a wool blanket, muting everything it covers. The roads were quiet. Even the wind chimes seemed unsure of whether they should bother ringing. When I pulled up, her porch light was still on, the warm glow faint behind the morning fog. I hesitated for a second before getting out of the van. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I just didn't want to disturb the stillness. Maybe I was starting to feel the weight of this quiet bond we'd been building, and it scared me a little. Not because it was bad, but because it was real. It's funny how connection sneaks up on you, how it goes from being a series of polite visits to something that feels like part of your identity. I wasn't just the guy who fixed her sink anymore. I was part of her mornings now, part of her space, and she somehow had become part of mine. She opened the door with a smile that looked tired but warm. There was no tea this time, no radio playing. Just her, in a thick sweater and those same well-worn khakis, her hair still damp from the shower. I stepped inside, set down my bag, and followed her into the kitchen without a word. The metronome was sitting still on the windowsill now, unwound, silent, like it was waiting for a reason to tick again. The air felt heavier than usual, not in a sad way, but in that way people carry a memory they haven't spoken out loud yet. I could tell. Something was different. She sat at the table and motioned for me to do the same. For a moment, neither of us spoke. There was just the sound of Penny's light breathing from the corner, the distant hum of a refrigerator, and the subtle creak of the house settling. Then she looked up and said she had found a letter. One Jack had written her years ago but never gave her. Said it was in a box of old receipts in the garage, stuffed between tax forms and expired coupons. She didn't read it to me. She just held it in her hands like a fragile object, something sacred and dangerous at the same time. I didn't ask what it said. I didn't need to. The expression on her face told me it had pulled her backward and forward at once. Like good words always do. She said it reminded her of who she was back then, of the woman she had once been, before time and grief and silence had thinned her edges. We spent the rest of the morning going through the garage, not looking for anything in particular, just pulling boxes off shelves and brushing dust off the past. There were old Christmas lights tangled like memories that didn't quite work anymore. Photo albums with notes scribbled in the margins, mugs from places they'd traveled to decades ago, Montreal, Santa Fe, Bar Harbor. Each item was a story, waiting to be remembered, and she shared them like someone passing out pieces of a puzzle she had been assembling alone for too long. At one point, she found a small wooden box, the kind you'd use for jewelry or letters, and opened it slowly. Inside were 2 wedding rings, one hers, one Jack's, and a tiny folded note that just said, "For safekeeping." She didn't cry. She just stared at them and smiled in a way that made my chest tighten. There's something about a person who has lived a full love and survived the quiet after that hits differently. It's not about sadness. It's about endurance, about carrying on without bitterness. We brought a few things inside that day. Not a lot. Just a few photos, the letter, and the metronome. She set them carefully on a small table in the corner of the living room, arranged like a memory altar. She didn't call it that, but that's what it looked like. A place where the past could sit with her without being a ghost. I offered to hang a photo on the wall, a black and white image of her and Jack laughing, mid-movement, probably caught, between steps of a dance, and she nodded. I found a nail in the junk drawer, a hammer from the hall closet, and hung it above the metronome. When I stepped back to let her see, she just stood there quietly, then whispered, "He'd like that." I believed her. In the weeks that followed, we fell into an even deeper rhythm. I kept coming by, sometimes with no real reason at all. She would tell me when her arthritis flared up, when she heard from her daughter, when she baked something she hadn't made in years just to see if she still remembered how. We didn't always talk. Some days we would sit on the porch in silence, drinking coffee while Penny laid between us, twitching in her dreams. I found comfort in that silence, in that porch, in that woman who had slowly allowed me to exist within the stillness of her world. I didn't think of it as a relationship, not in the conventional sense. But it was something. A connection that didn't ask for a name. And then one day, she said she wanted to visit the lake. There was a reservoir about 20 minutes out of town, surrounded by trails and shaded benches, a place where she and Jack used to go every fall when the leaves turned. She hadn't been back since he passed. She asked if I would drive. I said yes before she even finished the question. The morning we went, she wore a scarf around her shoulders and carried a small thermos of tea. I drove slow, letting the roads unfold at their own pace. When we arrived, she didn't rush to get out. She just looked through the windshield for a while and said the trees were smaller than she remembered. We walked to a bench overlooking the water and sat. She poured the tea into 2 travel lids and handed me one. The wind was light, and the water barely moved. She looked out at the lake and said, "I thought coming back here would hurt more." Then she looked at me, her eyes clear and calm, and added, "But it doesn't. Not this time." That moment settled into me like warmth. I didn't respond, didn't try to put a bow on it. I just sat with her, shoulder to shoulder, letting the silence and the breeze and the tea do what words couldn't. We stayed like that for almost an hour, barely moving, just watching the day pass gently around us. And in that space, with the trees whispering behind us and the lake stretching quietly ahead, I realized something. I wasn't there to fix anything anymore. I wasn't the handyman, not really. I was just a man who had shown up, again and again, and somehow been invited into a life that had more to give than it appeared from the outside. And in return, I'd found something I didn't know I was missing. The air shifted after that visit, to the lake, not in a way you could point to, but in a way you could feel, like something had been released in her, or maybe simply acknowledged. The past hadn't vanished, and the memories hadn't dulled, but it was as if she had made peace with them by choosing to look at them directly, instead of from a safe distance. There was less hesitation in her voice after that day. Less of the quiet pulling back I had grown used to. She still moved slowly, still took her time with things, but her words came a little easier, her thoughts a little closer to the surface. It was as though she'd stopped bracing for the pain of remembering and started welcoming the presence of what had been. And I think, in some small way, she had begun to trust that not everything new had to mean a goodbye to what was old. We didn't talk about the lake trip again. We didn't need to. It had served its purpose. It had opened something between us that didn't require explaining. The following week, I stopped by with no particular intention, as had become our unspoken pattern. She was in the kitchen, rolling out dough for something, flour dusting the counter and streaking her sleeves. The radio played softly in the background, instrumental piano, notes like falling petals, and the house smelled like cinnamon and butter. It was the first time I'd seen her cook something from scratch. She said it was a pie her mother used to make. Didn't know why she felt like baking it. Just did. I sat at the table and watched her work, her movements patient, her hands remembering the steps even if her words couldn't always recall the details. There was something sacred about watching someone do something they used to do a long time ago, like muscle memory reaching across decades to shake hands with the present. While the pie baked, we went through a box of old vinyl records she'd kept in the hallway closet. They smelled like cardboard and basement air, the paper sleeves brittle at the edges. She handed them to me one at a time, naming the artists like old friends: Sinatra, Etta James, the Platters. Her eyes lit up when she found a scratched-up copy of Moon River. Said she and Jack had danced to it one night on a whim in the middle of their kitchen, barefoot, wine glasses still half full on the counter. She didn't ask if I'd ever danced with someone like that. She didn't have to. I think she could tell I hadn't. Or maybe she just knew how rare those moments are, even for people who have loved deeply. She placed the record gently on the table, tracing the edge with her thumb, and said, "We were young and stupid and lucky, not always in that order." When the pie was ready, she sliced it unevenly and handed me the bigger piece without ceremony. It was too hot and fell apart on the plate, but it was perfect. We ate in the living room, the TV still off, the curtains open just enough to let the late afternoon light slide in across the floor. Penny curled up at her feet, snoring gently, the soft hum of a life lived at its own pace wrapping around all three of us. We didn't talk much while eating, and I was starting to think that might be the highest compliment a person could give, letting someone exist in silence beside you without needing to fill the space with words. Later that evening, she asked if I could help her bring down something from the attic, said there were boxes she hadn't touched since the year Jack died. She didn't say why she wanted to look at them now, only that she felt it was time. The attic stairs creaked like a reluctant throat clearing, and the air up there was thick and unmoved, like it had been sealed away with the boxes. We worked side by side, dusting, sorting, lifting things that hadn't been lifted in over a decade. Most of it was what you'd expect: holiday decorations, old photo frames, a set of china she said she never liked but kept out of guilt because it was a wedding gift. But there was also a shoebox, taped shut and labeled in neat handwriting. "Lily." I handed it to her without opening it. She sat on the top stair, box in her lap, and just looked at it for a long moment. She didn't open it right away. She said her daughter used to keep all her little treasures in there: birthday cards, drawings, seashells, small notes Jack had written on napkins when she was a kid. Marlene had collected them, saved them, preserved them like relics of a time she still hadn't fully made peace with. They hadn't spoken on the phone in over 6 months, and I could see that each day of silence between them had etched itself into Marlene's posture, into the way she folded towels too precisely or arranged chairs just so. I asked if she wanted to call her, and she shook her head slowly. "Not yet," she said, "but maybe soon." She looked up at me then, her eyes not watery but full, and added, "Thank you for sitting with me in this mess. Some people only want the polished parts." That sentence stayed with me all night. It rang in my ears as I drove home, windows down, cool evening air brushing against my face like a reminder to stay awake to what matters. I realized how rare it is to be invited into someone's unfiltered life, to be allowed into the attic of their memory without being asked to clean it up or make it presentable. And I realized that's what made this whole thing so different. We weren't trying to fix each other. We weren't trying to rewrite what had come before. We were just showing up, witnessing, being present with the quiet and the clutter, and the beauty that came with both. The next morning, she called me. It was the first time she'd initiated. Her voice was calm, a little scratchy from sleep, and she said she just wanted to hear mine. I told her I'd be by later with breakfast sandwiches. She laughed and said only if they had bacon. I said I wouldn't dare bring anything else. When I arrived, she was already at the table, 2 mugs ready, one for each of us. The metronome had been wound and was ticking softly again, steady and sure. She had placed the lily box on the corner of the table, unopened but no longer hidden. That was her way of saying she was getting closer. That was her way of letting me know the story wasn't over yet, and that maybe, just maybe, some things long buried were finally ready to be seen in the light. The thing about time is that it rarely announces when something is ending. There's no bell that rings, no warning that this will be the last time you sit across from someone drinking lukewarm coffee or folding laundry together while talking about nothing in particular. Endings don't always wait for you to feel ready. Sometimes they just arrive. Quiet, uninvited, wrapped in a day that looks exactly like all the others. That thought stayed with me one afternoon as I sat across from Marlene, watching her sort through a drawer of old keys. She claimed she didn't remember what half of them opened, but couldn't bring herself to throw them away. Every lock meant something once, she said, letting a brass key slide through her fingers. Even if I don't remember the door, I understood that more than I wanted to admit. We all carry keys to things we've long since closed off. Some of us hold on just in case something, someone, finds its way back and still fits the lock. That afternoon was slow, quiet even by our standards, the kind of quiet that has weight. Not because anything is wrong, but because nothing needs fixing. It was the stillness of two people who have learned the rhythm of each other's presence and no longer feel the need to fill every moment with action. We sat in the living room, Penny dozing in the sunlight, the metronome ticking steadily from its perch by the window. Outside, the trees had fully turned, their leaves flaming red and orange, carpeting the yard with reminders that everything, cycles, even grief. I asked if she wanted to rake them. She said not yet. She liked the way they looked scattered, like nature had loosened its grip for a moment and just let things fall where they may. Eventually, we walked outside, not for any particular reason, just to breathe the cool air and feel the day as it passed. She held my arm, not because she needed to, but because she liked the feel of being tethered. There's a quiet comfort in walking beside someone who isn't trying to lead or follow, someone just content to move with you, at your pace. We circled the garden, and she pointed out things that had survived from when Jack was alive. Perennials he planted, a cracked bird bath he insisted on repairing every spring. Her voice softened as she talked about him. There was no pain in it anymore, just familiarity, like she had finally learned how to carry the love without letting the loss spill everywhere. Back inside, she asked if I could stay a little longer. She had something she wanted to show me. From the hall closet, she pulled out a thin, dusty notebook bound in leather. Its corners were worn, and the strap that held it closed looked like it had been wrapped and unwrapped 1,000 times. She handed it to me without explanation and went to make tea. I opened it slowly, unsure of what I was being trusted with. Inside were pages filled with her handwriting, poems, mostly. Some were dated back over 30 years, some as recent as just a few weeks prior. They weren't polished or formal, but they were real. Raw. Some were about Jack, some about Lily, and a few just about growing older. About mornings that hurt more than they used to, and nights that came faster than they should. When she returned, she didn't ask what I thought. She just sat across from me and sipped her tea, letting the act of sharing speak louder than any praise I could give. After a while, she said she used to write all the time but stopped after Jack died. Said the words didn't come as easily when there was no one waiting to hear them. I told her I was listening now. That seemed to settle something in her shoulders, like a muscle unclenching after holding too long. She didn't smile, not exactly, but her face shifted into something softer. She looked at me, eyes steady and without hesitation, and said, "I don't feel invisible when you're here. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a confession meant to change anything. It was a statement of fact, and it hit me harder than I expected. We live in a world where being seen is confused with being noticed, where likes and views are mistaken for connection. But here, in this quiet house with its ticking metronome and half-finished crossword puzzles, I realized that being seen, truly seen, is something far more intimate. It's not about being impressive. It's about being witnessed, honestly and without expectation." The next day, I brought her a new notebook. It was plain, unlined, with a simple soft cover and a small embossed feather in the corner. She turned it over in her hands, then opened it and wrote something on the first page. I didn't ask what it was. She didn't offer. It wasn't for me. It was for her. But she left the book on the kitchen table when we had tea, and I noticed that each day I returned, A new page had been filled. The act of writing had returned to her like breath, unnoticed until it's gone, powerful when it returns. The days got shorter. The sunlight stretched longer shadows across the living room, and the air grew colder, even with the heater humming, steadily. One evening, as we sat wrapped in blankets watching the last of the leaves fall, she looked over and said something I hadn't expected. "You know, if I'd met you 20 years ago, I might have asked you to stay." I didn't answer. There wasn't an answer to give. We both knew the truth in that sentence, and we both knew it didn't need to be acted on. It wasn't a suggestion, it wasn't regret, it was gratitude, for the timing that wasn't perfect but still mattered. That night, as I left, she handed me something folded in a napkin. It was a cookie she'd baked, oatmeal, slightly burned around the edges, but made with intention. "So you don't forget," she said. I laughed and told her I couldn't even if I tried. She nodded, but her expression stayed serious. "Don't disappear, Sam," she said. "People do that. Slowly. They stop coming. They fade." I told her I wouldn't, and I meant it. But I also felt the shift in her words, the weight of them. She was beginning to prepare herself. For what, I didn't know. But she'd lived long enough to sense when something was changing, even if it hadn't arrived yet. Back in the van, I sat for a moment before starting the engine, holding the napkin in my lap. Through the windshield, I could see her silhouette, behind the window, standing still, not waving, not watching, just present. And in that moment, I realized something that settled deep in my chest. I wasn't just visiting her anymore. I was a part of her life. And she was a part of mine. And the scary, beautiful truth was that neither of us knew how long we'd have to keep sharing this space between two very different lives that had somehow, against all odds, found rhythm. The first snow came earlier than anyone expected. It wasn't heavy, just a soft dusting that powdered the lawns and softened the world into silence. I had driven out to Oak Hollow that morning with the heater barely keeping up, windshield wipers brushing off flakes like a slow metronome beating. Time across glass. The streets were mostly empty, the kind of quiet that only comes with early winter before the chaos of the holidays arrives. When I pulled up to Marlene's house, the porch light was on, as usual, casting a warm yellow glow against the gray of the sky. But something about it felt different. The light was on, but it didn't feel like she was behind it. I stood outside for a second, taking in the stillness before walking up the steps and knocking. No answer. I knocked again, waited, then tried the door. It was unlocked. That wasn't unusual, she often kept it that way when she expected me. But as I stepped inside, I immediately noticed the absence. The heater was running. The tea kettle sat cold on the stove. Penny was curled up in her usual corner, but even she looked unsure, her eyes lifting toward me without her usual wag of the tail. I called out once, then again. Nothing. That's when I saw the note on the kitchen table, written in her familiar, careful handwriting. 4 words, "Gone for a checkup." Underneath, a folded paper towel held a fresh scone, still soft. That was it. No details, no time, no place. Just a note and a baked good, as if she couldn't leave the house without leaving something of herself behind. I waited. I made tea, the way she did, steeping it longer than necessary and pouring it into the mug she usually gave me. I sat at the table and watched the window as snow continued to fall, each flake finding its way to earth with a kind of grace I envied. Hours passed. Penny didn't move. I didn't either. It wasn't panic that held me still. It was something quieter, something closer to acceptance, but edged with unease. I wasn't family. I wasn't her child, her sibling, her husband. I wasn't anyone who would be listed on a form or called in an emergency. I was just the guy who fixed her sink. But we both knew that wasn't really true anymore. She came back, just before sunset. Her car pulled slowly into the driveway, and I watched her step out, her movements cautious, deliberate, like every muscle was thinking twice. When she saw me in the window, she didn't smile. She just nodded. I opened the door before she reached it, and we didn't speak as she took off her coat, placed her gloves on the counter, and walked to the kitchen table. She sat down slowly and exhaled, not dramatically, but deeply, like she had been holding something all day and was only now letting it go. I didn't ask. I waited, and after a while she began to speak. It wasn't anything catastrophic. It wasn't a terminal diagnosis or a dramatic reveal, but it was real. Her heart was slowing down. Not dangerously, not yet, but noticeably. Her doctor had recommended more rest, fewer stairs, lighter meals, less exertion. She listed it off like a shopping list. I just listened. She said she wasn't afraid. She said Jack's heart had given out in an instant, and she'd always assumed she'd follow him that way too. But now, it looked like hers had chosen a slower route. "It's just getting tired," she said, "like the rest of me." Then, she smiled, small and without self-pity, and added, "But I've got time. I just want to spend it well." We didn't talk much after that. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, and I just sat there, letting the moment stretch. Outside, the snow had thickened. The yard was disappearing beneath a soft white blanket, and the trees looked like someone had traced their branches in chalk. Penny had finally moved to curl up beneath her chair, as if sensing the weight of the moment and needing to be close. I thought about how many people live their entire lives surrounded by noise, cars, conversations, obligations, and still never feel truly heard. And here I was, sitting in a quiet house with a woman who had taught me the value of presence, and it felt more full than any crowded room I'd ever stood in. The next day, I came back with a plan. I'd seen the narrow stairway to her attic, enough times to know it wouldn't be safe for her anymore. I brought supplies, storage bins, labels, an extra lamp, and I started reorganizing, slowly bringing everything down, cleaning it, sorting it, making space. I told her we'd move, the important things downstairs. She didn't argue. She just watched from the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes following me like a metronome set to a slower tempo now. Every few minutes, she'd ask me what I'd found. I'd hold up something random, an old coat, a box of greeting cards, a cracked mirror, and she'd give me a short story to go with it. Some were funny, some were just facts, and a few she paused on, holding the air between us before continuing. At one point, I found the box with Jack's tools. She had mentioned it before, once or twice, but never in detail. I carried it down, dusted off the lid, and set it on the table. She looked at it like an old friend she wasn't sure she was ready to see again. After a while, she opened it. Slowly, carefully. Each wrench and screwdriver had its own story. She lifted one and said, "He used to pretend he knew what he was doing, even when he didn't." Then she chuckled and added, "That's how most men get through life, I think." I nodded. She wasn't wrong. Later, we moved one of the old armchairs from the guest room into the living room. It faced the window. I told her it would be her new reading spot. She sat down in it like she'd been waiting years for that chair to find its home. The metronome ticked beside her, soft and steady, and she looked out the window at the snow falling again, her breath fogging the glass just a little. She said, "This feels right." And I knew she didn't mean the chair. Before I left that night, she did something she hadn't done before. She reached for my hand. Just for a second. Her fingers closed around mine like a memory trying to stay real. She said, "Thank you for not disappearing." I said, "I told you I wouldn't." She said, "People say that. Then life gets loud." I nodded. And in the silence that followed, in that small, dimly lit living room, surrounded by memories and falling snow, I realized that this wasn't about fixing things anymore. This wasn't about houses or tools or routines. This was about witnessing a life, one that still had music left in it, even if the notes came slower now. There's something about snow that makes everything feel quieter than it really is. The sounds are still there, the creaks of the house, the hum of the heater, the ticking of the metronome. But they all soften, like the world is whispering for the sake of those who need rest. That was the kind of quiet that filled Marlene's house in the days that followed. She moved slower, spoke less, but somehow her presence felt larger than ever. Maybe it was because I had finally learned how to hear her without her needing to speak. Maybe it was because I knew that time, while still present, was moving differently now. It had gone from endless to precious, from background noise to something that needed to be noticed. Every minute felt like a frame in an old film reel, flickering with meaning you couldn't always describe, but knew mattered. She stayed mostly in that armchair we'd moved, bundled in layers, eyes following the snow as it shifted from soft to heavy and back again. Penny rarely left her side, sometimes resting her head on the blanket that always covered Marlene's lap, as if the dog understood the gravity of this new rhythm. I came by every day now. It was no longer about maintenance or routine. It was about being there. I brought groceries. I brought soup. I read to her from books she'd already read years ago. She told me I had a calming voice. I told her it was just the tone I used when reading invoices out loud. She smiled at that, small and real. The kind of smile that stays with you longer than most conversations. One morning, she asked if I could help her write something. I expected another grocery list or a note to Lily, but instead she pulled out a blank card and handed me a pen. "Write what I say," she said, her voice thin but clear. I nodded. "Tell him," she began, pausing between thoughts, "that I forgive him. Tell him I know he didn't know what to do with love that didn't look like control. Tell him I loved him anyway." She didn't say who the note was for. She didn't need to. Some names don't have to be spoken aloud to fill a room. When she was done, she closed her eyes and leaned back in the chair. I placed the card in the drawer of the table beside her without asking any more questions. That was never the point. That afternoon, she asked me to play something on the radio. I turned the dial gently, trying to land on something soft, something honest. A jazz station came through the static, warm and smooth like a voice from another time. She nodded slowly, eyes still closed, her lips mouthing along to the piano like she remembered each note from a life that felt both near and far. I sat across from her, watching her chest rise and fall, and thought about all the lives people live in one lifetime. The young girl who taught music, the mother who kept shoeboxes of napkin notes, the wife who danced barefoot in the kitchen, the widow who baked pies when she missed someone, and now this woman in front of me, who asked nothing of the world except that it not forget she existed. Later that week, Lily came. I hadn't expected it. Marlene hadn't mentioned reaching out. But one afternoon, just as I was chopping vegetables for soup, the doorbell rang. And there she was. A woman in her early 40s with her mother's eyes and a hesitation in her posture that said she'd taken too long to make this trip. She introduced herself, though I already knew. We didn't shake hands. We just exchanged a nod that said, "I understand why you're here." I led her into the living room where Marlene sat, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Lily knelt by the chair and rested her head on her mother's shoulder. No tears. Just that. Just contact. That's what needed to happen first. And then slowly, over the next few days, words began to return between them. They were clumsy, at first, careful, but real. Lily stayed in the guest room. We took turns cooking. We sat in quiet threes around the fireplace, the house now holding a fullness I'd never felt in it before. Marlene seemed lighter, not healthier, not stronger, but freer somehow, like something unfinished had found its conclusion. She and Lily would go through boxes together now. I'd come into the living room and find them side by side on the floor, surrounded by photographs and receipts and ticket stubs, their heads tilted together in concentration. I didn't intrude. I just watched from the hallway, heart tight in my chest, knowing I was witnessing something rare. Healing doesn't always look like dramatic tears or long apologies. Sometimes it looks like two people sitting cross-legged on the carpet, deciding what to keep. One evening, Marlene asked if we could go back to the lake. She wanted all three of us to go. It wasn't warm anymore. The trails were damp with frost, and the trees had surrendered their leaves weeks ago, but we went anyway. We packed thermoses and layered coats and drove slowly, letting the silence between us be something we shared instead of avoided. At the lake, she didn't walk far, just far enough to reach the bench, the same one she and I had sat on before. She rested there between us, her gloved hand in mine, the other in Lily's, her eyes scanning the horizon like she was looking for something invisible but familiar. We stayed until her breathing got slow, not from sleep, but from peace. And when we left, she looked back once, just once, and said, "It's different now, but still beautiful." On the drive back, I didn't speak. I just watched her in the rearview mirror, her head against the window, her breath fogging the glass. She looked like someone who had finally found the ending of a story they thought might go on forever. And that wasn't sad. It was sacred. I realized that we rarely know when we're in the last chapter of something until it's already been written. But she knew, and I think I was starting to know too. Back at the house, I helped her into the chair, set her tea down beside her, wound the metronome, and took my usual seat across from her. She opened her eyes for a moment and said, "This is the safest I've felt in 50 years. Then she closed them again. And I just sat there, letting that sentence echo through the room like a final chord, hanging in the air longer than anything else she'd ever said to me. The last snowfall came the night after that visit to the lake. It wasn't heavy, but it was persistent, drifting down steadily through the early hours and settling like a final layer on a story that had been unfolding one quiet day at a time. I remember waking up early the next morning with the strange clarity that sometimes comes before you know something is about to shift. Not dread, not urgency, just the kind of stillness you feel before a wave breaks. I made coffee, sat by my own window, and watched the sky begin to brighten behind a blanket of gray. Everything outside looked soft-edged, like the world had decided to whisper. When I arrived at Marlene's house, it was already warm inside. Lily answered the door. Her eyes were red, but her face was peaceful in a way I hadn't seen before. She didn't say anything. She just stepped aside. I walked in and saw Marlene in the chair by the window, the same chair we had moved just weeks earlier. She wasn't asleep, but she wasn't in pain either. She looked like she had simply slipped into another rhythm, one softer and slower than even this world could offer. Her hands were folded gently in her lap, and the metronome beside her had stopped ticking. Unwound, still, not broken, just finished. Lily walked over and placed a light shawl over her shoulders, more a gesture of grace than necessity. We didn't cry, not then. The air was too sacred, too full. There was something deeply respectful about that room, about the way the morning sunlight touched her face, about the way Penny lay curled at her feet, unmoving but aware. For a long time we just sat with her, the three of us, not speaking, just present. I'd spent months learning how to sit in silence with her. It felt only right that we give her this last moment in the same way. Later that afternoon, as arrangements were made and phone calls began, I went out back to the garden. The snow had settled on every branch, every flower bed, every inch of grass. The old bird bath was half covered, and the wind chimes barely moved. I stood there for a long time, hands in my pockets, letting the cold sting my fingers, trying to hold on to something I couldn't quite name. I thought about all the stories she'd shared, all the small rituals we'd built. Morning tea, quiet walks, passing glances that said more than full conversations. I thought about the day I'd come to fix a faucet, and how I'd ended up fixing nothing, really, except maybe some part of myself I hadn't even known was broken. In the weeks that followed, Lily and I sorted through the house together. We packed slowly, gently. There was no rush. We labeled boxes with care, pausing often to read a note, unfold a scarf, flip through a record sleeve. Every object felt like it carried a pulse. Every drawer we opened breathed out some remnant of Marlene's life. A napkin with a shopping list written in pencil, a photograph tucked into the back of a cookbook, a page in her journal that simply read, "Today was calm." Sam brought tea. It didn't take much, just a few words to say everything. One afternoon, as we were cleaning out the bedroom closet, Lily found a small envelope taped to the inside of a cabinet door. Her name was on the front. She didn't open it right away. She just held it in her hands and stared at it like she was trying to feel the weight of everything inside before she read it. I stepped outside to give her space. When she came out to join me, her eyes were glassy but dry. "She forgave me," she said quietly, before I could even ask. I nodded. There was nothing else to say. Sometimes peace is silent. Sometimes love writes its own closure long before the final page. On the final day in the house, we stood in the empty living room. The rugs rolled up, the chairs gone, the metronome packed away in a box with her books. Lily had decided to keep the house. She said it felt like the right thing to do, like maybe it could hold something new without forgetting what it had already been. She planned to repaint the kitchen, plant herbs in the windowsill, maybe even adopt another dog so Penny wouldn't be alone. But for now, we just stood there, in the quiet hum of a house that had been lived in fully, and I knew I would never see another space quite like it. Before I left, Lily handed me something, a plain envelope with my name on it. Inside was a letter, written in Marlene's handwriting. Not long, just a few lines. She wrote that she hadn't expected me to stay, that most people don't, that what I gave her wasn't time or help or service, but presence. And that presence, more than anything, had reminded her that she was still here, still seen, still alive in the ways that mattered. She ended with this: if the world had more people who simply showed up, it would be a softer place. Thank you for being soft with me, Sam. I hope someone is soft with you too someday. I folded the letter slowly and slipped it back into the envelope. I didn't read it again. I didn't need to. I'd carry those words with me in the rhythm of my own quiet moments, in the way I spoke to strangers, in the way I waited a little longer before walking away. I drove home that evening with the window cracked open, the cold air sharp and clean, and the faintest sound of wind chimes still echoing in my head. I wasn't grieving, not in the traditional sense. I was remembering, and in that remembering, I was giving her the only thing I had left to offer, my own presence, carried forward into the life I still had left to live. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Some stories don't end the day someone leaves. They echo. Not in the dramatic sense of unfinished business or ghostly memories, but in the way you start seeing the world differently because of them. That's what happened with Marlene. Her house may have emptied, the windows cleaned, the rugs rolled up, but her presence lived in all the places that didn't need furniture to feel full. I felt her in the early mornings when the sky was gray and quiet, in the way I brewed tea, a little slower, letting the steam rise like breath I wasn't rushing to exhale. I caught glimpses of her in storefronts that sold antique radios, in garden gloves hanging by checkout counters, in the way certain piano notes stretched just a little longer than they needed to. There's a kind of grief that isn't heavy. It's gentle, like the weight of a coat you still hang by the door, even though no one's coming back to wear it. I didn't go back to the house for a while after Lily settled in. I wanted to give her space to make it her own, to let her grieve and rebuild without me hovering in the doorway like some leftover character from her mother's life. But one afternoon, weeks later, I got a message. It was short. Just a photo of the sunflower vase sitting in the kitchen window, a new metronome ticking beside it. Beneath it, Lily had written, "Still keeping rhythm." I didn't reply. I just stared at it for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen, knowing that no words I sent would carry what I felt. But it mattered. That photo, that choice, the fact that she hadn't removed the reminders, but arranged them into something new. Like she wasn't trying to erase the past, just continue it differently. In the months that followed, my life didn't change dramatically. I was still a handyman, still taking calls, still fixing sinks, squeaky hinges, and the occasional faulty outlet. But something about the way I approached those jobs was different. I started staying a few extra minutes longer. I asked people how they were, and waited for the answer. I started noticing when someone's eyes said something different than their words. I wasn't just there to repair broken things anymore. I was there to be present, fully, patiently. Not always, not perfectly, but enough. Every so often I'd visit the lake. Not on special occasions. Not for nostalgia. Just when I needed to remember that peace is often found in still places. I'd walk the same path Marlene and I had walked, sit at that same bench, and watch the water do what it always does, move gently, endlessly, with no need to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes I'd bring a thermos of tea. Not because I liked tea that much, but because she did. And in those moments, I wasn't just honoring her memory, I was keeping her rhythm alive in my own life. People asked me about her, from time to time. Clients who'd seen the van parked outside her house. Friends who noticed I smiled a little differently. I'd tell them pieces, never the whole story. Not because I wanted to protect it, but because I knew some stories lose their weight when told too directly. Marlene wasn't a headline. She was a footnote that changed the whole page. She was a quiet room that made you realize how loud the rest of the world had become. She was a simple sentence that stayed in your head long after the book closed. Eventually, I found the letter again. The one she'd written me, folded neatly in that plain envelope. I hadn't read it since the day I received it. But one evening, long after the snow had melted and the trees had begun to bud again, I opened it. The paper had a faint smell, lavender maybe, or just time. Her handwriting was still steady, the curves of her letters familiar like the face of a friend you haven't seen in years but never forgot. The words didn't surprise me, but they struck deeper the second time. She'd thanked me for listening, for showing up, for helping her feel like she hadn't disappeared. And then, near the end, she'd written something I hadn't truly absorbed the first time around. Presence is a kind of love, too. Not the loud kind, not the kind with promises, but the kind that stays. That's what you gave me. You stayed. I folded the letter again, but this time I didn't put it away. I kept it in the glove box of my van, not as a relic, but as a reminder. That love doesn't always look like romance. That connection doesn't always mean commitment. Sometimes, it's just about being where you said you'd be. Sometimes the greatest gift is to quietly hold space in someone else's life. Not to fix, not to rescue, but simply to bear witness. To be the steady thing in a world that changes too fast and forgets too easily. Marlene's story wasn't extraordinary in the way people usually mean. There were no grand events, no public accolades, no viral moments, but for me, for Lily, and maybe for Penny, it was everything. It was the kind of story that teaches you how to live slower, how to listen closer, how to soften in a world that rewards hardness. And if that's not extraordinary, I don't know what is. It's strange how some people enter your life through side doors, not with introductions or fanfare, but quietly, almost incidentally, like a job on a Tuesday morning. And yet, over time, their presence seeps into the architecture of your days so deeply that when they're gone, it's not the noise you miss. It's the silence. That was what lingered after Marlene. Her absence didn't echo like a shout. It settled like dust in familiar corners, reminding me in the softest ways that she had been there, that she had mattered. I would still drive past Oak Hollow every now and then, and sometimes I'd catch myself slowing down near her house. Not to stop, not to stare, just to acknowledge it. Like tipping your hat to an old friend sitting quietly on a porch no one else can see. The house looked different now. Lily had painted the shutters a pale green. The porch railing had been repaired. A few flower pots sat on the steps, bright and full. It no longer looked like a place waiting for something. It looked like a place being lived in. And that made me oddly emotional, though I didn't say anything the first time I saw it. Life had gone on, just like it always does, and that wasn't betrayal. It was tribute. When someone you love passes, and you choose to keep living, you're not leaving them behind. You're carrying them forward in the way you move, the way you see, the way you sit longer in the spaces they once filled. I remember one particular Saturday, maybe 3 months after her passing, I was at the hardware store buying screws and wire when I overheard an elderly man asking an employee for help with something simple. Some kind of bathroom fixture. The employee, clearly rushed, brushed him off with a half answer, and moved on. Without thinking, I stepped in. Asked what he needed. Walked him to the aisle, helped him find the right part. He smiled and thanked me more times than necessary. But what struck me most was how long he stood there, talking afterward, about the weather, about his wife's cooking, about how his knees didn't work like they used to. He wasn't there for a fixture. Not really. He was there for presence. For proof that someone saw him, heard him. That moment felt familiar. It felt like something Marlene would have noticed. So I stayed. I listened. And when I walked away, I realized that this too was part of what she'd left behind. I started keeping a journal. Nothing elaborate, just short notes, a few sentences, each day. Things I'd seen, people I'd met, feelings I couldn't quite name. I wasn't trying to document life as much as I was trying to mark it, like planting flags in the soil of my own awareness. It became a kind of ritual, something quiet, sacred. A space where Marlene lived on, not in memory, but in motion. In how I carried myself, in how I noticed things, in how I kept showing up for moments most people walk right past. One morning, I got a text from Lily. It was short, like most of her messages. She never used more words than she needed. It read, "We're having people over, thought maybe you'd like to come." Attached was a photo of the kitchen, newly painted, with string lights hanging across the ceiling and a tray of lemon bars on the counter. The sunflower vase was still in the window. I stared at the image for a long time before responding. Then I wrote, "I'll bring tea." She sent back a smiley face. No words. Just that. And somehow, it said everything. That evening was the first time I'd been back inside the house since we'd packed it up. It felt different. Brighter. Not louder, but fuller. There were people laughing, music playing, glasses clinking. Life had returned to the walls, not in spite of the past, but because of it. I stood in the corner for a while, sipping my tea, watching it all. Lily caught my eye from across the room and gave me a nod, a kind of silent thank you I didn't need explained. Later we sat on the porch together. Penny jumped into my lap like no time had passed. Lily handed me one of the lemon bars and said, "Mom would have liked this." I said, "She would have added nutmeg." She smiled and said, "She always did." We didn't stay out long. The night grew cold, and the guests began to trickle out. But before I left, I stepped into the living room one more time. The metronome wasn't there, but I didn't need it to hear the rhythm. It was in the pacing of footsteps through the hallway, in the way chairs scraped the floor, in the soft laughter trailing from the kitchen. The house had a heartbeat again. And in that, I felt her presence more fully than I had in months. Not as memory, not as shadow, but as rhythm. Ongoing, enduring, still ticking, even in stillness. I walked out slowly, tea thermos in hand, the night pressing gently around me like a familiar coat. As I reached the sidewalk, I looked back at the porch light. It flickered once, softly, briefly. I smiled. Not everything needs to be explained. Some things just are. Some goodbyes are permanent. Others become part of your pattern. You learn to live with them. You learn to walk beside them. You learn that showing up for someone else, for yourself, for a memory, is not just an act of kindness. It's the proof that something once mattered and still does. Some people leave behind legacies measured in buildings, books, or businesses. Others leave behind moments, quiet ones. A look, a habit, a sentence that loops in your mind at the oddest times. Marlene didn't have an estate or a foundation. She didn't have awards hanging on her walls or newspaper clippings tucked into scrapbooks. What she left was smaller, quieter, but somehow more permanent. A rhythm, a softness, a way of being. And long after she left this world, I still felt myself moving to it. In how I brewed tea. In how I paused before answering. In how I listened. Not just to people, but to silences. The pauses between words. The spaces people leave when they don't know what to say. That's where she lived. And that's where she stayed with me. It's funny how many people go through their lives without being truly seen. Not in the way that says, "I notice you," but in the way that says, "You matter," even in your quietest state. That's what I learned from her. That visibility isn't about being loud. It's about someone choosing to remain close while you unfold slowly. She taught me to slow down, to stay, to let stillness be enough. She never gave me advice in the traditional sense. No long monologues, no life lessons delivered like parables. But she taught me by living near me, by letting me near her. And I think that's the most honest kind of teaching there is. I kept my journal going. It's grown into a little shelf now, lined with simple black notebooks. each filled with snippets of days that would have otherwise blurred together. Inside are grocery lists from old clients, overheard conversations in hardware aisles, and small gestures I would have missed if not for her. There's an entry from a few weeks ago, just one line. The woman at the diner hummed to herself while folding napkins. Sounded like Moon River. I didn't need more than that. Just that detail. Enough to remind me that the world still has these pockets of quiet beauty, if you're tuned in to notice them. I don't talk about Marlene often. Not because I don't want to, but because she feels too close to turn into a story for casual conversation. She wasn't a moment that changed my life. She was a presence that shaped it gently like water on stone. She's in the way I don't rush to fill silences anymore, in how I say goodbye a little slower than I used to, in how I pause at yellow lights instead of speeding through them. These aren't grand changes. No one would point at them and say, that man was transformed. But I was, and I am. Still. Sometimes people ask me how I handle the loneliness of working alone, driving from job to job, fixing things for people I may never see again. I used to brush it off with jokes or routines, but now I think I understand it better. I think that kind of solitude only hurts when it feels empty. But mine doesn't. Not anymore. Because now I carry someone with me, not as a memory I pull out when I'm sad, but as a presence that walks beside me. When I fix a faucet, I hear her say, "He'd tighten it too much just to prove a point." When I sit with someone a little longer after finishing the job, I remember how she once said, "Some people just want proof that you'll stay 5 minutes longer than you have to." And so I do. I stay. I listen. I let the moment stretch past the point where it's convenient. That's my way of honoring her. Not through grief, not through tribute, but through repetition, through presence, through choosing to live the way she made me feel safe, steady, seen. I'm not trying to be profound. I'm just trying to live in a way that carries her forward. A few weeks ago, I got a thank you card from someone I barely remembered helping. Inside was a simple note. "You stayed when you didn't have to. Thank you for that." I read it twice. Not because it was long, but because it sounded familiar. Like something I'd heard before. Like something Marlene had once said. And I realized that maybe that's how her story keeps going. Not through me telling it, but through me becoming it. In pieces. In practice. In the simple act of staying. So, if you've followed this far, through the snow and the silence and the tea and the tools, then maybe you've felt her too. Maybe she's reminded you of someone you loved, or someone you lost, or someone you wish you'd had more time with. If so, I hope you sit with that feeling. I hope you let it slow you down. Because sometimes, what the world needs most isn't more noise. It's more people who know how to sit still with someone else, who know how to stay 5 minutes longer than they have to, who know how to keep rhythm with a heart that beats a little softer than the rest. Marlene didn't need the world to remember her. She just needed one person to. And I do. There's a moment after the story ends, after the last word has been spoken, and the last light turned off, where everything feels strangely suspended. You sit with the weight of it, not sure whether to move or just let it settle into your bones. That's where I found myself in the weeks and months after Marlene's passing. Not lost, not grieving in the traditional sense, but caught in that space just past the final page. The world hadn't stopped, but it had slowed. And in that slow, deliberate pace, I began to notice things with new eyes. The way people look down when they walk past each other. The way the elderly lean ever so slightly toward warmth. The way hands linger near teacups long after the conversation is over. I began to see that life isn't made of moments that scream for attention. It's built from the quiet ones. The ones that whisper if you're willing to listen. Marlene taught me that. Not through instruction, but through presence. Through repetition. Through consistency. She showed me how the small, steady things we do for one another matter more than any grand gesture. And that has changed the way I move through the world. I no longer rush through jobs just to clear my schedule. I don't treat kindness like an accessory. It's a responsibility now. A rhythm I've chosen to keep. There's this old saying that people won't remember what you did or what you said, but how you made them feel. But I think that's only part of it. I think they'll remember where you stood when it mattered, whether you stayed, whether you showed up when there was no applause, no payoff, no audience. Sometimes I think about how the world sees people like Marlene, quiet, older, tucked away in small houses on forgotten streets. To the world, they're often invisible. Background characters in a story moving too fast to notice them. But she wasn't invisible. She was a universe in one chair, a library in a pair of tired hands, a love letter to patience, to stillness, to grace. And I wonder how many other Marlenes are out there, waiting for someone to knock, not to fix something, but to sit, to ask, to stay. Every now and then, I drive past houses I've worked in before, not to check on the plumbing or the wiring, but to remember the people, the man who gave me a slice of pie without saying a word, the woman who couldn't find the breaker panel but insisted on offering me socks because the floor must be cold. They're not clients. They're markers on the map of who I've become. And lately, I've started bringing extra tea bags in my glove box, just in case. You'd be surprised how often someone says yes when you ask, "Can I make you a cup?" I keep Marlene's letter in a small leather pouch now. Not because I'm afraid of losing it, but because I want it close. Not every day. Not always. But on the days when the world feels too fast, too cruel, too indifferent, that's when I pull it out. That's when I remember what it means to be safe. Not protected, not guarded, safe. The kind of safety that says, you're allowed to be fully yourself here. That's what she gave me. And it's what I try to give now, wherever I go. There's a younger couple I help out from time to time. First-time homeowners, lots of questions, not a lot of tools. The wife said to me last week, "You remind me of someone's dad." I laughed, but something about the way she said it felt oddly comforting. Like she wasn't just talking about age or demeanor. She was talking about energy, about stability, about that presence again. And I think maybe that's what we're all chasing, even if we don't have the words for it. That solidness, that unspoken promise that someone will keep showing up even when the job's done. Especially when the job's done. I don't think Marlene ever intended to change anyone's life. I don't think she saw herself as a mentor, or a guide, or even as someone particularly wise. But in her quiet way, she did all those things. She redefined what companionship could look like. She proved that not every connection needs a title to matter, and that maybe the best kind of love is the kind that arrives without demand and leaves without regret. Just presence. Just rhythm. Just a metronome ticking beside the window long after the music has stopped. In the end, what she gave me wasn't a lesson. It was a posture, a way of being. A reminder that there's beauty in the ordinary, meaning in the mundane, and dignity in just showing up for someone else. That's what I carry now. That's the rhythm I try to keep. And every time I hear a wind chime sway or see a sunflower in a vase or sit a few extra minutes with someone who needs company more than conversation, I know she's still here, not in the past, but in the way I've chosen to live now. As spring began to fold its warmth across the town, something in me shifted again. Not sharply, not with drama, just like the season itself. Incremental, slow, but undeniable. I was back into my routines by then, but they didn't feel the same. I still had work, still made house calls, still kept my calendar organized with blue ink and scribbled reminders. But it all felt quieter. The noise inside me had softened, and in its place was a kind of patient observation, like I was walking through life not to get somewhere, but to see more clearly the spaces I used to pass by too quickly. Maybe grief does that. Not the heavy, immediate kind, but the kind that lingers like a fog and eventually becomes a lens. It doesn't distort things. It just reveals what was always there. I found myself noticing windows. I know that sounds strange, but I did. Noticing how different homes framed their view of the world. Some windows were wide open, their curtains pulled aside like the house itself wanted to invite the world in. Others stayed sealed, with blinds angled just so, allowing light, but no attention. And then there were the ones like Marlene's. Clean, clear, but soft. Lived in. Like someone had stood at that pane many mornings with a mug in hand, simply watching. Being. I began to recognize those homes without ever stepping foot inside. Them. The ones that carried history, not in clutter or renovation, but in presence. I wondered who was inside. I wondered how many people, like her, had a room full of silence and stories no one had heard in years. And then I wondered how many people actually had someone willing to sit down long enough to listen. That became a strange little mission of mine, not formal, not spoken. Just something I carried with me. I started slowing down at jobs. Not to stretch time, not to manipulate it, but to allow for space. I began to sense when someone needed more than a fixed hinge or a replaced fuse. The old man who asked me about my day 3 times in 1 hour because his memory didn't hold things the way it used to. The woman who insisted I have lemonade even in winter, because that's what she always used to do for her husband. The teenager who hovered near the door as I worked, not saying much but clearly just wanting to witness someone doing something. Steady. I gave them time. I didn't always know what to say, but I stayed. That's what Marlene had given me. The permission to stay. To treat time not like a currency, but like a canvas. To understand that being present with someone, even in silence, even in the boring parts, could be more valuable than anything I could fix or build. It started changing the way I measured my days. I stopped tracking hours the way I used to. Stopped feeling like I had to optimize every minute for output. Sometimes I'd write in my journal, "Today felt full," without needing anything particularly noteworthy to justify it. Just a long conversation. Just a second cup of coffee, shared across a chipped table. Just the sun falling across a porch the same way it always had. I'd get calls from Lily sometimes, nothing major. Updates about the house, little things she was fixing up. She asked me once if I thought her mother would have liked the new wallpaper in the guest room. I told her probably not, but that she'd love that Lily was asking. We laughed about that for longer than the joke deserved, and in that laugh, I heard something healing. Not finished, not perfect, but real. I knew Lily still had questions she hadn't asked her mother, things she'd never get answered. But I also knew she was finding peace, not in the answers, but in the continuation. She was doing what her mother had done for years, tending to the space around her as a way of tending to her own soul. One day, while helping a client install a new kitchen counter, I saw a small, worn metronome sitting on their piano. Not the same brand, not the same color, but it ticked in the exact same slow, deliberate rhythm. The client said it had belonged to her mother, said she kept it running even though she didn't play anymore, just because the sound made the house feel alive. I nodded and said I understood completely, and I did. I really did. That soft, repetitive tick had become a kind of spiritual anchor in my life. A reminder that movement didn't always need to be loud to be meaningful. That you could still be going somewhere, even if you were moving slowly. It was after that visit that I decided to buy one for myself. I found it at a secondhand shop, dark wood, a little beat up, but it worked. I placed it on the windowsill near my reading chair, and every morning I'd wind it, let it tick while I drank my coffee, let it tick while I wrote, let it tick while I sat and looked out the window. No music playing, no agenda, just that sound, steady and grounding, reminding me that life continues, not in the big crescendos, but in the small, consistent beats that happen when no one is watching. I think that's how we carry the people we've loved, not by trying to recreate them, not by holding on to grief like a shrine, but by picking up the rhythms they gave us and continuing them. One cup of tea, one quiet visit, one more reason to stay just a little longer. In that way, they never really leave. They become part of the way we breathe, part of the way we move through the world, part of the way we love, even when the words never get said out loud. It's been over a year now. Time has done what time always does. It moved on, unconcerned with how ready we are for its passing. The trees have cycled through their colors. Again, the lake has frozen and thawed and frozen again, and the world has, in its usual quiet insistence, kept spinning. And yet, even with all that motion, Some things have remained still. Some moments don't pass. They settle. They take up residence in you like a room you didn't know you were building, and every so often, without meaning to, you find yourself sitting in it again. Just for a while. That's how it is with Marlene. She isn't part of my memory in a way that fades. She's part of my framework now. I carry her not as a story, but as a way of seeing. There are still days when I half expect to see her, maybe walking slowly through the garden path she used to prune, or sitting with Penny under the sun, wrapped in that old knit shawl. I know she's gone, but the house still carries her. Lily kept most of it intact, not out of stubborn nostalgia, but because some places don't need to be redesigned to stay alive. They just need to be respected. I visit occasionally, not often. But when I do, it always feels like walking into a memory that hasn't fully set. The couch is still in the same spot. The kitchen still smells faintly of black tea and something sweet. And the metronome, now sitting on a shelf beside a photo of her smiling on the porch, still ticks whenever Lily remembers to wind it. On one visit, Lily gave me something that surprised me. It was a small, faded envelope with my name written on it in handwriting I knew instantly. Marlene must have written it in her final weeks, maybe even final days. I opened it carefully, the paper delicate with time. Inside was a single sheet. Not a long letter, just a few lines, but it stopped me cold. She wrote, "If you're reading this, then it means you kept showing up. I always knew you would. People, like you, don't disappear. They just find new places to stay. Thank you for being my place, even for a little while." I folded it slowly and didn't say a word. Neither did Lily. Some things don't need commentary. Some moments are full all on their own. I've thought a lot since then about what it means to be someone's place. It's not about location. It's about presence. It's about being the thing someone leans into when everything else feels too loud, too fast, too temporary. And more than that, it's about allowing yourself to be shaped by those moments too. I didn't just show up for Marlene. She showed up for me. She gave me a model for gentleness in a world that often rewards the opposite. She reminded me that steadiness is its own kind of strength. That staying, listening, witnessing is a kind of love that leaves a mark deeper than words ever could. That realization changed the way I saw all my relationships. I started calling my brother again. Nothing dramatic. Just short conversations, here and there, bridging the years that had grown between us. We didn't solve anything overnight, but we started showing up again, and that felt like enough. I also started visiting my mother more often, not because anything was wrong, but because I didn't want to wait until it was. I brought her tea sometimes, Earl Grey, her favorite, and we'd sit in her backyard and talk about the same 5 things over and over. And every time she laughed, at a joke I'd heard a dozen times, I thought of Marlene. I thought about the way she smiled when she told old stories, not because they were new, but because they were still hers. And then there's the work, the people I meet every day, the houses I walk into with my tool belt slung over one shoulder and my boots caked in dust. They don't know my story. They don't know what's behind my silences or why I linger a few extra minutes after the job is done. But sometimes, just sometimes, they look at me like they feel it. Like they know I'm not just fixing a broken thing. I'm trying to bring a little peace, a little presence, a little of what Marlene gave me. Even if it's unspoken. Even if it's unnoticed. I've come to believe that the most sacred kind of legacy is the kind no one ever puts your name on. It's the way someone pours tea a little, slower after you're gone. The way they sit with someone without rushing them to speak. The way they notice a widow at the grocery store and smile just a second longer. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, but it ripples. Marlene's legacy is in my days now. In how I treat people. In how I stay. And if I'm lucky, if I keep living the way she lived, maybe I'll pass a little of that on too. Maybe I already have. There's a moment that comes long after someone is gone when you stop mourning the absence and begin celebrating the presence they once gave you. It doesn't happen suddenly. It sneaks up, like the way you stop noticing winter's edge and realize the snow's begun to melt. I felt that shift on a walk, a simple one. No destination, just movement. I wasn't thinking of her when I started. I was thinking of errands, my schedule, how I needed to pick up more nails and maybe get the van looked at. But as I turned down a quiet street near the edge of town, I passed a house with sunflowers in the window, and I stopped. The curtain was half drawn, and the glass was just a little fogged, like someone had been standing there moments before. I stood still for a while. Not to stare. Not to intrude. Just to acknowledge it. That moment wasn't about coincidence. It was about invitation. The world reminding me gently that the people we've loved stay close. Not in place, but in rhythm. Later, that day, I visited the lake again. It wasn't a pilgrimage anymore. It wasn't about clinging to something. It was just a place I liked to return to. A bench that faced the water. A view that never asked for anything, just gave. I brought a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a thermos of lukewarm tea. Sat. Let the breeze move across my shoulders, and the sun touch the tops of the ripples like it had done since long before any of us came along. A couple walked by with a dog, the leash held loosely, the dog's tail wagging with no sense of purpose other than joy. The man nodded at me. I nodded back. And just like that, I realized I hadn't spoken all day. Not a single word. And yet, I didn't feel lonely. That's the thing. Solitude and loneliness aren't the same. I'd learned that from Marlene. You can be alone and still feel surrounded by everything that matters. I thought about her hands that day. How they moved slowly. Not because they were weak, but because they were deliberate. Everything she touched, she gave full attention to. The handle of a teacup. The spine of a book. The edge of a blanket she always folded the same way. There was something sacred in the ordinary with her. And I think I've started to emulate that without even trying. The way I wipe down counters after a job. The way I fold my own shirts now. The way I take my time sealing an envelope. Like the contents deserve more than just a quick goodbye. That's how her legacy lives, in the care applied to the smallest tasks. In treating every little thing like it matters, because it does. Few weeks ago, Lily invited me to a small gathering at the house. She was hosting some friends from out of town and a few neighbors. Nothing big. Just food, music, warmth. I hesitated but said yes. I didn't dress up. Just wore what I always did. But when I stepped inside and saw the lights strung across, the ceiling, the sunflower vase in its usual spot, the record player humming in the background, I felt like I'd walked into a memory that had evolved instead of disappeared. People were laughing. A dog barked from the backyard. Someone was telling a story I couldn't hear the end of, but the punchline was strong enough to make the whole room lean back in delight. And in the middle of it all, Lily stood at the kitchen counter, mixing something in a bowl and humming to herself. I didn't know the tune, but it didn't matter. It was the sound of someone at ease in their own story. She handed me a slice of pie. Apple, with a little too much cinnamon, and we stood by the window for a while, looking out over the neighborhood that had once been Marlene's entire world. Lily said softly, "You know, some days I still forget she's not going to walk in and ask if the tea's steeped enough." I smiled and said, "She'd probably say you're using the wrong kind of sugar." Lily laughed. She would. There was no ache in that moment, just warmth. That's what healing looks like sometimes. Not forgetting, not even moving on, just laughing again without guilt. That night, I left the house feeling something new. Not lighter, not heavier. Just more whole. Like a chapter had closed, not because the story was finished, but because it had said everything it needed to. Not every story needs a bow. Some just need space to breathe. I didn't need to return to the house again after that. Not because I didn't care, but because I'd brought enough of it with me to carry forward. And that was the quiet miracle of it all. Marlene had become part of how I lived, not just how I remembered. When I got home, I wound the metronome on my windowsill. Let it tick while I made tea, while I scribbled a few words in my journal, while I watched the sky fade to dusk through my own slightly smudged glass. I didn't feel profound. I didn't feel enlightened. I just felt present. And if there's one thing she taught me, really taught me, it's that presence, simple and patient and real, might just be the greatest offering any of us ever give. Think we all live for a handful of moments that change us. Not loudly, not instantly, but deeply. The kind that plants something small in the soil of our days, and over time, that seed grows into the way we see the world, the way we treat people, the way we carry ourselves through the ordinary. I didn't know it when I first walked into Marlene's home to install her kitchen sink, but that job would become one of those moments. Not because of what I fixed, but because of who I met. And even now, long after the last repair, long after the final visit, I still feel her presence. Not as memory, not even as grief, but as rhythm. Quiet, persistent rhythm. A kind of internal metronome that reminds me to keep showing up, to stay present, to be the steady thing someone else can. Lean into life, I've come to realize, doesn't offer closure the way stories do. People don't get perfect send-offs. There are no fade-to-black endings in real life. Just transitions, just changes in pace. And sometimes, the final page isn't where the story ends. It's where you begin to write differently. That's what this has been for me. Not a goodbye, but a shift in how I live. A soft vow to never treat time with someone as disposable. To never rush a goodbye. To never assume the next time is guaranteed. The last entry I wrote about Marlene wasn't long. It didn't try to capture everything. It didn't eulogize her or distill our connection into neat sentences. It simply said, "She made the silence feel safe. I want to do that for others. That's all. That's everything." In a world that gets louder every year, people crave silence. But not empty silence. Safe silence. The kind where you don't have to perform. The kind where you can breathe and be and not feel like you're wasting anyone's time. That was what she gave me, and what I now try to give to others in small, quiet ways. I've gone back to the lake just once since that last visit with Lily. Not for nostalgia. Not to relive anything. Just to sit. I brought no tea. No book. I didn't even bring my journal. Just myself and the wind and the water. I sat on that bench, stared out over the stillness, and listened. Not for voices, not for signs. Just for the pulse of the world as it is, unhurried, unpolished, alive. And in that moment, I realized something simple and true. We don't need to hold on to people to keep them close. If we've listened to them deeply enough, if we've let them shape our rhythm, they never really leave. They become part of how we walk, how we sit, how we see. Back at home, the metronome still sits on the windowsill. I don't wind it every day now. Not because I've forgotten, but because I don't always need it to remind me anymore. The rhythm is in me. It's in how I wash dishes a little slower. In how I say, "Take your time," and actually mean it. In how I pause before responding. In how I show up, not just physically, but emotionally, for people I care about, and even for strangers who just need a little more patience than the world usually gives. That rhythm, her rhythm, lives on. And maybe that's the best legacy any of us can hope for. Not to be remembered with grand gestures, but to be felt in the quiet ways someone chooses to be kind. I never expected to become a man who would sit for hours with someone just to share tea, or who would notice how the light hits a table differently in winter than in spring. But I am that man now. And it's because of her. Because of the way she let me into her life slowly, steadily, without expectation. And because she reminded me, without ever needing to say it, that you don't have to be loud to be meaningful. You just have to be present. So, here's what I know. At the end of it all, the greatest stories aren't the ones with the most drama or the highest stakes. They're the ones that change how you move through the world afterward. They're the ones that stay with you not as memories but as patterns, as choices, as new ways of showing up. Marlene's story was small by most standards. No viral headlines, no fame. Just one woman in one house on one quiet street. But she changed me. She softened me. She slowed me down enough to actually live. If you've listened this far, then maybe you've felt it too. Maybe there's someone in your life who made you better just by being there. Maybe you're that person for someone else without even knowing it. Either way, I hope you carry the rhythm forward. I hope you sit longer, listen deeper, forgive quicker, love quieter but more often. I hope you become someone's safe silence. Up next, You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.